Thanks, Jake. To follow up on the cluster munitions, last year in March, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she described those munitions as, quote, exceptionally lethal weaponry which has no place on the battlefield. So how do you square those comments with this decision? And secondly, has Ukraine provided you with any assurances or guarantees in terms of their use in civilian areas, that they won't use them within a certain radius of civilian areas, for example?
So Ukraine has provided written assurances that it is going to use these in a very careful way that is aimed at minimizing any risk to civilians. And by the way, Ukraine, the democratically elected government of Ukraine, has every incentive to minimize risk to civilians because it's their citizens. It's Ukrainians who they are trying to protect and defend. This is not Ukraine taking these and going and using them in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or in some faraway land. They're using them on their territory to defend their territory. So we believe that they're highly motivated to do this, and beyond being highly motivated, they have, to directly answer your question, provided these assurances to us. In terms of the ambassador's comments and other comments that have been bandied about, let me just say that the use of cluster munitions by Russia in this conflict is completely unacceptable on multiple counts. First, they are using them to attack a sovereign country in flagrant violation of international law. Second, they are using them specifically to strike after civilian targets, not only military targets, also in flagrant violation of international law. And with this weapon system, as well as other weapon systems, we have identified war crimes committed by the Russians. Third, and critically, there is a big difference between the type of cluster munition being used by Russia and the type that we would provide to Ukraine. As I mentioned before, ours have a maximum 2.5% dud rate. The dud rate of the Russian munitions is between 30 and 40%. And just so I don't get this wrong, I will read it to you. The Department of Defense assesses that during the first year of the conflict alone, Russian-fired cluster munitions deployed from a range of weapon systems have likely expended tens of millions of submunitions or bomblets in Ukraine. And then the final point, I think this is an important point. When I talk about what Russia's doing with cluster munitions, I'm not making an argument which says, they do it, so we'll do it. The argument I'm making is that Russia has already spread tens of millions of these bomblets across Ukrainian territory. So we have to ask ourselves, is Ukraine's use of cluster munitions on that same land actually that much of an addition of civilian harm, given that that area is going to have to be demined regardless? So that is why when we look at the situation today, as opposed to a year ago, and when we look at what Ukraine would be doing with these weapons as opposed to what Russia is doing with these weapons, we see a substantial difference. It doesn't make it an easy decision, and I'm not going to stand up here and say it is easy. It's a difficult decision. It's a decision we deferred. It's a decision that required a real hard look at the potential harm to civilians. And when we put all of that together, there was a unanimous recommendation from the National Security Team, and President Biden ultimately decided, in consultation with allies and partners and in consultation with members of Congress, to move forward on this step.
And Jake, are you satisfied with the pace and progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive thus far?
We get this question a lot. I'm not grading or judging the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'm standing here in Washington, D.C. I'm not on the battlefield. My life's not on the line. So for me to sit here and say, I'm satisfied, I'm not satisfied, what I would say is that it is hard going. The Russians are dug in. They have thrown a lot of defense in manpower and munitions at this, and the Ukrainians have bravely, systematically been punching and pushing forward and will continue to do so. The Ukrainians also have a substantial amount of capacity. They have not yet committed to this fight. So the story of this counteroffensive is far from written, and we will continue to support Ukraine along the way.
Jake,
yes.
You said that Ukraine provided written assurances for how they would use these munitions. When was that provided? And also, can you just provide more details on what are those assurances?
So they provided them in the context of their written requests to us for these munitions. So they reached out and requested them. I couldn't give you the exact date, but some weeks ago. And in doing so, the assurance that they provided was that they intend to use these munitions in a way to minimize the exposure of civilians, so outside of civilian areas and outside of areas that civilians traffic. That is to say, on the battlefield where they are presently both trying to defend their territory and to move forward.
Are there specific locations, though, red lines in those assurances, or did the administration advise them, only use these munitions in these specific locations?
This is going to be an ongoing conversation because obviously the battlefield is shifting at all times. So it's impossible to set down a map and define this with the level of specificity that maybe your question implies. But it does mean that this conversation needs to be ongoing, just as it is with every other weapon system that we're providing Ukraine. And so far, we have found that when Ukraine provides assurances to the United States about the use of its munitions, it has followed through on that in terms of the limitations and constraints it's placed on those. And we expect the same in this case. And I just want to underscore again, I know I sound like a broken record, but the idea that Ukrainian men and women fighting for the armed forces of Ukraine want to willy-nilly use these things in a way that are going to harm Ukrainian citizens, which is somewhat implied in the questions, I find, at odds with their fundamental desire to protect their countrymen and their willingness to put their lives on the line to protect their countrymen. So that's
Prigozhin's location?
I do not.